William, that was extraordinary. Thank you so much. We couldn't have started the day any better, any more energetically, and any more provocatively. So going from this sort of incredible description, I think, of both the hardware and the software of the East India Company, to now think about other forms, other routes, other forms of infrastructure that were somehow willed into being through trade, but then once they had come into being, they, in a sense, begin to produce other effects, and in a sense, produce other forms of hardware and other forms of software. So, of course, the Silk Road is one of the most famous trade routes in history. And it's been one of the key kind of catalysts for us thinking about this theme of trading places. I was reading about the Silk Road, and something really struck in my mind. It was a reminder that China had had silks 2,000 years before the rest of the world got it. 2,000 years, amongst other things. But then the Silk Road is bit by bit, or roads, plural, because it's not a single road. I mean, that's one misnomer. It's, in fact, a kind of neural network. But there was a description which was very beautiful, that the silk was sent out, and then, of course, other goods came back into China, but ideas came back into China. And those ideas changed the fabric of China itself. And, of course, that then creates a kind of feedback loop. And so every trade route, which assumes that it's there to initiate a transaction of goods, of material goods, or of people, or of laborers, in fact, inevitably always produces a kind of flux, a reciprocity of ideas, of values, of information, much of which is often unintended. And so there's kind of unintended consequences was something that we wanted to explore in this forum. So, and as William was telling us, some of these instruments of trade thinking take on the scale of the planet itself. And by doing so, they begin to become imaginative ideas in their own right, figures of speech or thought. So again, something hardware, software, the concrete to the abstract. So I'm really deeply thrilled to be able to introduce now I think, two of the most interesting artists, well, one artist collective and another artist who are working today. The artist collective Slavs and Tatars was founded in 2006 by Kasia Kozak and Payam Sharifi. Many of you may know their work. It's kind of multifold in media. They often start with cycles of research, which then manifest in lectures, in books, and yes, of course, art that you can buy and you can see it at a fair like this. But I think what, for me, really stands out is the depth of the research and the fact that they've chosen to take a kind of a vast swathe of the planet that, in a way, felt neglected, felt like a massive blind spot, what they describe as the zone from the Berlin Wall to the Great Wall of China. And then, in a sense, perform a kind of archaeology but that's done with immense intelligence and wit. Trevor Paglen is an artist whose work spans image making, sculpture, investigative journalism, writing, engineering, and numerous other disciplines. Among his chief concerns are learning how to see the historical moment we live in and developing the means to imagine alternative futures. And again, I mean, for me, at a very personal level, Trevor's work is really, really important. There are a number of thinkers, I think, today, and Trevor is one of those, Hito Steyl, who we had last year as well, who are working at the absolute frontier of technology, information, and our sense of how it is that we might know and might not know what we know. And Trevor's work is really exceptional, and I think his background as an experimental geographer makes him one of the leading authorities in how information, ideas, and space kind of come together in unfamiliar and kind of new volatile complexes. So we're going to start. I've asked both Payam and Trevor to give us 2 brief presentations, and then we're going to have a conversation and we'll open it up to you. So will you please first join me in welcoming Payam Sharifi from Slavs and Tatars. Thank you.
Thank you, Shumon, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be on this distinguished panel. As you mentioned, the region we're devoted ourselves to over the past decade has sort of fallen into the margins of history over the past century, but that's probably an exception and not the rule, in the sense that, of course, the Silk Route we think of, but it's also the great game between the English and the Russians. The Mughal Empire that William so extensively mentioned in relation to the East India Company. Of course, the Mughal Empire also, Babur comes from this region, Central Asia, as do many thinkers. And the kind of golden age of Islam that we speak about really happens at the margins and not at the center. I think that's what's interesting about the geographies that we're exploring is to what extent ideas ideologies, belief systems are thriving at the margins and at the rims as opposed to the center, which often is quite rotten, whether that center is DC, London, or even Mecca in some extent. So before moving on, the series of slides that I'll be going through is a series of tracing name changes and how these city names have basically changed as empires have fought over them, almost like sort of kids lost in a custody battle of divorces between Turkic. Our region, of course, is a particular region because it's largely Muslim, but it's not the Middle East. It's largely Russian-speaking today, but it's not Russia. It's largely in Asia, but has never been under Chinese rule except for Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs are. So it's an in-between zone in many senses of the term. And of course, as children, we could never have known that the East would one day move West, or today that the West would move East. It's a very strange and perverse idea, the idea that a direction could move in another direction. While Parisians, Londoners, and New Yorkers moved over the past decades east to escape high rents, the ghost of gentrification trolled them, as it did the establishment, who used to present the shift westwards as a kind of manifest destiny. Today, alas, a Polak, or a Pol, sees himself first as a Pole, second as a European, and if pushed, as a Slav. Eastern Europe calls itself Central Europe, and even, just to show how quickly history changes, even some Eastern European Slavs have no problem with the term Mitteleuropa, which, of course, 20, 30 years ago would have been unimaginable, or 50 years ago. We've come far away, but we're no closer to understanding where here begins and there ends. The penchant for the absurd stems from a glut of being dislodged, often from within, as if from one's own present. Displacement happens long before the search for work or studies. It happens in utero. At home, we're often no less displaced than abroad. We're not nomads, but we're rooted to one too many places. The problem is the places in our heads and hearts sometimes fail to recognize the places on the maps, and vice versa. We're like the hair on a mother's head, pulled in different directions by her numerous children. It hurts, but as John Cougar once sang, it hurts so good. The country we call home, the country we used to call home, and that we dream to call home are all very different and distinct places. It's a result of a productive schizophrenia. We're in all of them at once, a ravishing sensation, but tempered by a slow, sobering devastation of never being in any one entirely. Now, I wanted to focus on one particular slide, which is this one here, Khojand. Khojand in present-day Tajikistan used to be called Alexandria the Furthest, right? There were many Alexandrias all across the steppe, and Khojand was the furthest one from Alexander or Iskander himself. And you can see these, we've tracked, basically, we've kept the original script also, not only for the names themselves in their original language, but also for the large minorities or majority minorities that were living in those cities at that time. Another interesting one, of course, is in Kazakhstan, Astana, the present-day capital of Astana, which Shumon today asked me, are there any cities that have changed since we published this book called Love Me Not? And Astana, there's discussions today of perhaps changing Astana to Nur-Sultan, the first name of the current leader, Nazarbayev. But Astana used to be called Akmola and Selinograd. Selinograd comes from Selina, meaning virgin soil, and Akmola, Ak meaning white, and Mola was the Ablai Khan, who was basically, there was a very famous shrine on the top of the hill right outside of Astana. There's another, of course, as William mentioned, the more you look into history, of course, the more complex it becomes, and there's contesting theories that, in fact, it was named White City because of the large amount of dairy production that was happening there. And of course, if you know something about the steppe and Mongols and dairy, today the West is blessed with sort of a craze for fermentation, yogurt, kefir in Whole Foods, 10 different brands of kefir. You still can't find kumis, which is fermented mare's milk. Now, during the Soviet Union, 256,000 horses were kept just to supply fermented mare's milk for Central Asians on standby. And mare's milk is quite tough. Mares don't produce much milk, but there was a great sort of anti-drinking campaigns during the Soviet Union saying, so no vodka, just kumis. And as we go further, of course, more obvious ones like Shah Rud becoming Imam Rud after the revolution in Iran, and other cities. Now, there's also in our region interesting ones like in Ukraine, a city we associate with kind of a very strong Jewish literary history. Isaac Babel, Odessa, of course, used to be called Haji Bey. Now, there's nothing more Turkic or Muslim sounding than Haji Bey. And Haji, of course, Haji Giray, was the first ruler of the Crimean Khanate, which was the longest living, kind of the most extensive duration of the Turkic Khanates that followed the Golden Horde. And Haji Giray was responsible for this, which is what has since become the symbol of Tatar nationalism, this Tarak Tamha, which is a kind of trident of Giray's. And it was derived from the scales insignia of the Golden Horde, in fact. But again, there's a contesting theory that it comes from not Haji Bey, but Katsubiev, because Haji Bey was actually supported in his struggle against the Golden Horde by the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And when we tend to think of Lithuania and Poland, we tend to think of victim countries, right? Always sort of either sort of sandwiched between Germany and Russia. But in fact, Poland and Lithuania were an empire, a short-lived empire in the 17th century, one of the more enlightened empires with representative government before that in the US. And to such an extent that it was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, there was a kind of movement of Sarmatism, a kind of romantic movement when the Szlachta, the kind of gentry of Poland at the time, believed that they were the long-lost descendants of an Iranian tribe from the Black Sea. So it was kind of a myth of origin. So they would dress as if they were long-lost descendants of Persians in long robes, carrying fur. And when the Poles came to the defense of the Austrians against the Turks, there was a very funny episode where essentially they couldn't distinguish between the Turks and themselves because they dressed like Turks themselves. So this is the kind of the hussars basically were dressed as they imagined the Turks, and it was a relatively accurate sort of imagination. I shouldn't say Turks, the Ottomans. And of course, there's questions of internal colonization. When we think of Russia, we've recently been looking at Russian Orientalism as a kind of counterpoint to Saidian Orientalism. Said's Orientalism really studied England and France, but he deliberately, or not deliberately, but he himself admitted not looking at Germany and not looking at Russia. Unlike England and France, Russia didn't go across oceans or across seas halfway across the world, but went right across the border to people who had previously conquered it. So imagine the Indians being, you mentioned this kind of reverse colonialism. It's as if the Indians were in England in the 14th century, and then 3 centuries later, it's sort of our turn. So it kind of deflates that missionary zeal.
The East India Company is now owned by Gujarati.
Okay. A perfect sort of, yes, coming full circle. And in Russia, of course, there was also not only a silk route, but a fur route. And there's a great text by Alexander Etkind, who argues that it was not the sword, but the axe which moved Russia's sort of empire eastwards, because the Russians moved eastwards in a kind of manifest destiny in the same way that the Americans had a manifest destiny westwards, both to the Pacific, pushing sort of in opposite directions. Atkins talks about man-made migrations of small, wild, furry animals defining the expansion of Russia. Winter roads, trade stations, and militarized storehouses for fur spanned across Eurasia, playing roles that were not dissimilar from the Great Silk Route in medieval Asia. Ecologically, colonization meant deforestation. And this deforestation, when Russia's first Orient, or Russia's first sort of the first time it started to use orientalizing tropes to discuss another region, was in Crimea and in Krim. And according to Crimean legend, there was so much deforestation that Crimea's temperature dropped 4 degrees after the Russians invaded, because the winds were sweeping down from Russia into Crimea. What's, of course, also interesting about Crimea is Crimea was not only Russia's first Orient, but it was also Russia's first Occident, because Russia suffers from a kind of inferiority complex that it missed out on this Western civilization, right? This false theory, this complete fabrication that somehow Greece led to Rome, and Rome came up through Italy and to France and Italy, and then westward and eastward to England and Germany. Of course, we know it came through the Muslim world, but even that myth Russia missed out on. And so when it conquered Crimea in the 18th century, when Catherine the Great conquered it, it laid claim to kind of a long-lost Greek tradition, because there was a sizable Greek minority for several millennia. In fact, the lingua franca of Crimea was Greek until the 9th or 10th century, I believe. And in fact, and Crimea has always been a kind of liminal territory. Herodotus called the Scythians, he located them in Crimea. When Sophocles writes Iphigenia, he writes it at Tauris. No, Euripides, sorry. Euripides writes Iphigenia at Tauris. She finds herself amongst barbarians in Tavrida. Even Tauris, of course, was the Greek name that Catherine the Great gave to Crimea. And they renamed the Dnieper River into the Borysthenes. So it was this kind of another romantic myth of origins, looking at Crimea. Now, another interesting thing about Crimea is that there's a really interesting tradition of Karaites in Crimea. Karaites were a sect of anti-rabbinical Jews, anti-Talmudic Jews, who are sometimes called the Shia of Judaism. And you'll understand why, because they're adepts of sort of taqiyya, or dissimulation. Now, according to legend, Anan ben David was this leader of the Karaites, and he found himself in a prison next to Abu Hanifa in the 7th century. And Abu Hanifa gave him sort of advice on how to not argue over who's the true Jew, but just set up another sect. And what's interesting about Karaism is that today the largest population of Karaites live in Israel, but they originally come from Egypt. And because they've always lived amongst Muslims, they've taken on certain Islamic rites and rituals. For example, before they enter the Knesset, which is their synagogue, they take off their shoes. They wash their feet in a musluk, in a kind of the ablutions. And what's interesting also about this trading places, but also trading identities across this region, is that in the 19th century, the Karaites convinced the the Russian Tsar that they were not ethnic Jews, so they should be exempt from the taxes on the Jews, and they should be able to live wherever they wanted in the Russian Empire. And they were granted this access. 50 years later, when the Germans and the Nazis occupied Crimea, they had also convinced the Nazis that they were not ethnic Jews. They said they were Turks who happened to become Jews much later, much after the kind of original sin of crucifying Jesus. So they were in no way responsible for what happened to Jesus, and they survived the Holocaust in a kind of strange turn of fate. And this is the letter, of course, one of the letters that was establishing their different identity amongst the Judaism. Now, I'll end quickly by reading a short passage from Enseng Ho's Graves of Tarim, and I think it's quite relevant to how we trade places, but also trade identities, and trading the places of birth and death. Enseng Ho writes, "In a society of migrants, what is important is not where you are born, but where you die. This, if nothing else, makes a diaspora entirely different from a nation, both in concept and in sentiment. Persons belong to nations by virtue of being born into them, but individuals claim entitlement issuing from place of birth, And the nation itself takes its name from the act of giving birth, nasi. For migrants, by contrast, place of death is important because it often becomes a site of burial. Tombstones abroad acknowledge a shift in allegiance, from origins to destinations, that migrants take whole lifetimes or more to come to terms with. Where shall I be buried? Did the deceased leave instructions? In the old days, when migration was a journey to one's fate, that locational shift within consciousness marked the larger turn of the generations, from ancestor to descendants. Graves, while they are endpoints for migrants, are beginnings for their descendants, marking the truth of their presence in a land. For many diasporas, then, graves are significant places. Abroad, migrants who could no longer be close to their parents can be visited by their own children. Graves provide a ready point of return in a world where origins keep moving on. A gravestone is a sign whose silent presence marks an absence. In this, the idea of a grave comprehends the many experiences of migration much better than that of globalization, which loudly shouts its presence everywhere. Devices for speed allow persons to appear in many places at once, as voices in telephones, faces on the internet, and bodies hurtling along in supersonic jets. In contrast to globalization's industrial instantaneity, diaspora is of long duration, with only 4 or 5 generations per century. How long do immigrants take to be assimilated? Some never are. Those who do disappear. Absence rather than presence everywhere shapes diasporic experience. While globalization denies absence by rushing around to cover it up, diasporas do the opposite. They acknowledge absence and chronically explore its meanings and its markings, such as at the grave. Is the absence of the dead forever? Will they come back? Will we join them? Is the absence of immigrants forever? Will they come back or will we join them? In old diasporas, questions of absence never go away. They continue to provoke responses each generation. Indeed, the sharing of such questions and arguments over them create and demarcate a society that one might call a diaspora. And in this sense, the diaspora is not unlike a religion. Thank you very much.
So I guess what the kind of thing that I've been looking at is looking at maybe some of the descendants of the trade routes that we all kind of know from history, and looking at the ways in which those routes have become infrastructures, right? They've become infrastructures that have encircled the planet, and have not only encircled the planet kind of on a horizontal axis, but have gone from the depths of the oceans up to the land and then up into the skies in the forms of satellites and drones and these kinds of things. So looking at a kind of 3-dimensional axes of infrastructures that facilitates communication, facilitates trade, if you want to call it that. I always feel nervous about the word trade in the first place. And is also obviously has very much to do with military and control and domination and these sorts of things as well. I started really thinking about the physical infrastructure of some of these communication systems as a result of this guy showing up in 2013. And I was very good friends with Laura Poitras, who was the journalist that Snowden initially went to. And she asked me very early on, we're going to learn a whole lot about global telecommunications infrastructures and how the NSA exploits that. Would you be a part of that project on the research side, but then also in terms of thinking about how to make images of some of these incredibly technical systems that these documents were describing? That led to an involvement in this film, Citizen 4, which was about Snowden. But when I initially started working on this project, I was handed a pile of documents and told, okay, go figure out what these things mean. And they were documents that described very technical communications infrastructure. So they really described how the internet works. And how the internet works is really not something that we think about every day. So I had to go on a kind of a deep dive into this question of what is the internet. And this is something that we have terrible metaphors for in our everyday lives. If you do a Google search for the internet, I think this is the first image that shows up. Number 2 or 3 is this one. The internet is weird blue fireflies in orbit or other. What the fuck? This is literally a mystifying metaphor. We actually do have some metaphors that are very good, like this, and that is about right. But what the what the Snowden archives did, though, is it kind of gave you a pair of goggles that you could put on. And when you put this pair of goggles on, you would see the internet and global telecommunications systems through the eyes of somebody who was trying to exploit it. And as such, you have a very different set of metaphors that are being used to describe these systems. So when NSA or an agency like that looks at what the internet is, it's highly material and highly specific. It's cables that connect the continents to each other in very specific places. There's very specific things that are going through those cables, like wavelengths being modulated in certain kind of ways. There's a whole strategic apparatus associated with this, like looking quite literally at the geography of the infrastructure of the internet allows you to develop ways to exploit that, to take a kind of strategic control over it in various ways. It like quite literally points to the places in the world where you want to install sensors, where you want to install digital weapons or what have you, or the means to deploy them. And so looking at a map like this, I spent a number of years just going through all of the different kinds of things that are being described at this kind of strategic level of looking at how global telecommunications / mass surveillance, same thing, work. Obviously, cables are a big deal. You see all of these lines connecting the continents together. Those are undersea cables. About 99% of the world's information travels under the oceans over fiber optic cables, and those fiber optic cables connect the continents together in very specific places. The cables themselves have very specific names. SMW, this is Simewa. This actually is a cable that connects India to continental Europe. It makes a stop here on the other side here at Fujairah, actually, and goes up through the Red Sea and across the Mediterranean, lands in Marseille. Other cables, and these where it says these relationships, these are corporate relationships that NSA leverages in order to get access to these cables, right? When you start to understand the geography of this, you start to see landscapes very, very differently. So, for example, in this image here, if you know that looks like just landscape, whatever, nice sunset perhaps. But if you know that in the foreground of this image is a place in Cornwall called Widmouth Bay, which is one of the most kind of concentrated cable landing sites in the world, dozens of cables, fiber optic cables connecting Europe to the United States are coming onshore here. This series of dishes, i.e. this surveillance base on the cliffs overlooking that beach, starts to make a whole lot more sense. This is what the kind of domestic architecture of NSA surveillance of the U.S. looks like. Again, you see these cable landing sites here on the green dots with the lines coming out of them. The one project that I started doing was just going around to different places in the world and making photographs of the places where the oceans connected the continents, places where kind of the rules of the image were that inside the frame had to be this conjunction or this landing site or this choke point, as it were. But of course, those are invisible because the cables themselves are underwater and under the beaches. So I started pairing them with collages that were all documents that were speaking to things that were going on inside the photograph, but that are obviously also invisible in the photograph itself. This is a site north of San Francisco at a place called Manchester. The west coast of Oahu in Hawaii is a major place where a lot of this stuff happens. It's not a coincidence that Snowden was stationed in Hawaii because it really is the hub of communications connecting the U.S. to Asia. Northern Germany is another kind of hotspot in terms of this. Marseille, France is also very, very important to the world's global telecommunications architectures. So I was going around and making these kinds of photographs, and I thought, okay, I'm making photographs, the point of which is that you actually can't see the infrastructure in the photograph, right? Because the infrastructure itself is underwater or under beaches or what have you. But I thought maybe we can take this a little step further. I learned how to scuba dive in a pool in Kreuzberg, as you do, and started going around and trying to identify places on the bottom of the ocean where I thought you might be able to see these conjunctions of fiber optic cables. Hiring teams of mostly military divers and doing underwater searches to try to find the internet. When you do everything right, which is a lot of work, you find literally the information highway. It's underwater. This is an image off the west coast of Hawaii, and here you have this huge conjunction of dozens of fiber optic cables that are quite literally the internet. There's a cable called Columbus 3 connecting the U.S. to Lisbon, Americas 2 connecting the U.S. to Brazil. BIX 1 connects the U.S. to the Bahamas. So we have this this infrastructure that goes from the depths of the oceans up to the ground, to terrestrial infrastructures. When you look at the internet on land, again, you find these similar kinds of conjunctions. Like the internet is, of course, networks of networks. All of those networks have to meet each other in specific places. The places where they all meet are called exchanges. And in continental Europe, those main exchanges are in London, Amsterdam, and the really big one is in Frankfurt. Now, if you drive in circles around Frankfurt, lo and behold, there's all kinds of little NSA stations encircling the city. What they're doing, they're sitting on those Deutsche Telekom cables as they're going into the exchanges. So we have this kind of terrestrial architecture as well. But if we start to look up into the skies, we start to see that there is indeed a vast kind of architecture of communications, surveillance, militarization, and power that is quite literally inhabiting the night skies above our heads. For many years, I've done a project where I've tried to track all of the secret satellites that are in orbit around the Earth. And this is kind of a weird thing to be able to do. You would think, well, if they're secret, how would you know about them? Well, the military or what have you can have all the secret satellites they want. They can't have their own secret laws of physics. So there is a catalog of all the satellites that the UN keeps, and if you go out on any given night, you look up in the sky, you try to see something, you use binoculars or a telescope, you make an observation, you write down what you saw, a good measurement of what you saw. Then you can derive an orbit, look that up in the UN catalog. If you don't find it in the UN catalog, you've seen something that doesn't exist, right? You've seen something secret. And there's a group of amateur astronomers around the world who've been doing this for about 3 decades now, since the early 1980s, and kind of putting together this alternative guide or this alternative catalog of objects in the night sky that don't exist. And I've been going out and tracking them and trying to photograph them. This is and these images just show up as a streak over the course of a long exposure for the most part. So this is this little line. This is a kind of we all know about the Hubble Space Telescope. Well, there's lots of other Hubble Space Telescopes that are all looking down at Earth, and this is one of those. When you start looking in this, you start to come across the culture of these things that don't exist, which is quite interesting. You start to see what is the visual languages that people who work on these projects start to use to describe what it is they're doing. These guys is an outfit called the Rapid Capabilities Office. They were funding a project here called the X-37B, which is kind of like a secret drone space shuttle that's currently on its 4th mission. This is a photograph of that X-37B. I got my hands on the ground crews patch that they wear when they fly this thing. And it's funded. It's from the X-Files, right? It's from the X-Files, and their funding office is this Rapid Capabilities Office, whose Latin saying here translates as "doing God's work with other people's money." So we have this infrastructure going from the depths of the ocean to the continents to the skies above us, all of which are in many ways extensions of old trade routes and military routes and what have you. More recently, I've been trying to see inside these infrastructures. We're kind of experiencing, I don't know if you'd call it a revolution, but something very, very significant is happening with the advent of machine learning and artificial intelligence and the ability to do very, very powerful and very, very unexpected things with huge amounts of data that these kinds of systems that I looked at just now are collecting. And it's gotten to the point, I think, where, I'm an artist and I think about images a lot, and I think that something very radical has happened in visual culture itself, or in images itself, which is that I think that sitting here in 2017, most images made in the world are made by machines for other machines and are actually not even human readable. However, they still are images. And I've been trying to think through what that is. What are all the varieties of this? What are the kinds of things that one does? What are some of the systems that do this? Obvious examples would be something like a self-driving car, which is going around, it's filming its environments, it's translating that data, it's using it to navigate a car. You as a human, it's generating huge numbers of images every second, but you as a human don't have access to it, and it wouldn't actually even look like anything to you if you were. So we've been developing software in the studio that allows us to implement different AI algorithms, machine vision algorithms, and then makes images that shows us as humans how a particular machine vision or AI system is dissecting an image. In the case of something like facial recognition, we're trying to extract the actual faces that the recognition algorithm is looking for. It makes an abstraction of somebody's face. It doesn't look for your exact features. It's looking for what is distinct about your features compared to everybody else. So this is a kind of portrait of that, of Winona Ryder, as you do. This is a portrait actually of Hero, who you mentioned before too. This is a software that we developed, that we trained a facial recognition system to recognize her face, and then we wrote another piece of software that would generate noise towards in the direction of being able to recognize her. And when it got to the point where it was very, very confident that it was looking at her, this is the image that we have. So it's almost this kind of shroud of Turin. These are images that there are literally no names for. Like, we have no words to describe an image like this. This is an image that in the studio we've been calling a synthetic activation. It's an image that's made internally inside an artificial intelligence system to activate what they call a neuron, which is a point or a node within that AI system. This is activating a neuron called mask. So this is something that it would sort of imagine a mask is. This is another form of that for a shark, right? We've done a couple of projects around this just to wrap up. A couple of months ago, we did a project in San Francisco with the Kronos Quartet, where there was this musicians performing, and we were watching them as they were being seen through a whole suite of algorithms, from self-driving cars to cruise missiles to artificial intelligence algorithms over the course of the performance. Why don't we just leave it at that?
Wow, thanks so much, Trevor, and thank you for bringing us right up to Hans-Jörg Obrist and Douglas Coupland and I call the extreme present.
Yes, I was thinking about the earthquakes on the plane right here.
Yeah,
absolutely.
As long as you weren't experiencing it.
No.
But maybe we can sort of work backwards. I mean, one thing that I think, there's the obvious thing that, where there's an overlap, which is there because I guess I gave you the brief, which are all kinds, as I say, sort of forms of sort of civilizational infrastructure that have this planetary scale to it. But then the other thing that occurred to me as we were listening to all of you speak is the relationship between something that exists, something that is felt, experienced on an individual basis, but that can almost never be shown in its totality, right?
Sure.
So all those desperate attempts to show the internet, for example,
Yeah, absolutely.
which is really interesting, right? Like this striving to want to codify something in a single image,
Yeah.
right? Because I mean that's the weird thing. Language has that ability to do. Like we can say internet.
Yeah. Yeah.
We can say internet. We know what we mean, even though we might not know it in detail. But we can, by saying that one word, we can share in it. But if you were to show that image of the internet, what is that, right? So what is the image of the East India Company, for example, right? So your examples at the end were beautiful in the sense of showing particularities of how again that superstructure manifests in specific moments. But again, what would the single image of the East India Company be? And in your case as well, there's this, again, I always find it much, when we can sum it down to a sentence, this geographical region that you and Kash have been interested in so long. But again, what the extent to which it becomes tangible, palpable, livable requires different kind of methods. So that to me was sort of really, really interesting. So I wondered whether, maybe to start with you, Trevor, and work backwards. Are you on this pursuit? There seems something, there's this kind of pursuit to find the visibility of that which is not invisible.
Mm.
I mean, what's driving you to make these excursions, all these kind of intrepid, also forms of decodification, literally and analogically? Like, I mean, it's important to say, Trevor, you initially studied as an experimental geographer.
I say as an artist, and then geography coming out of art, actually, and that was coming out of landscape, actually, because I guess like when I do a talk like this, I'm sure it sounds to a lot of people like, oh, this guy's doing social science or something like that, which it is partly, but it's animated by a very kind of classical landscape tradition in art, right? Where in even like a lot of the images I showed, like, oh, here's the North Sea. I mean, for me, that's Caspar David Friedrich, in the sense of like I feel like the trick is like when you're an artist, you're making work. There's nothing in that tradition that I'm in. There's nothing in the world that you can look at that other artists haven't been looking at for literally thousands of years, and maybe even tens of thousands of years in some cases. And so the trick is, how do you learn how to see the specificities of what that landscape is in the moment in which you're in? And in doing so, you're having a conversation with the other people around you, because I'm saying, like, let's look at the North Sea, and I'm going to tell you that this is a really important part in terms of how global trade works, how global surveillance systems work, how power works. And this is, a kilometer away from where Caspar David Friedrich painted, the monk standing at the sea or what have you. And so how do we look at that same exact landscape and try to learn something about who we are now, what that landscape is now, how it's different from the past, but then of course you're always having a dialogue with your ancestors in that practice. And
you seem to be suggesting that there is faith in images. There's not necessarily truth. There's not necessarily truth, because I think what's always interesting, because I've seen you do lectures a number of times. So, as you say, a number of these landscapes that you show often have a quality of picturesque, almost sublime.
Yeah.
But without the commentary, without the caption.
That's right.
We're just literally seeing the threshold of the visible, which has a kind of patina of something beautiful, or But in fact, once you give us the caption, then it's, oh my God, right? Like that's actually what we're seeing, but we're not seeing.
Yeah.
But the image is really key in that, right? And what's not conveyed in the image of the landscape.
That's exactly right. I mean, I think to go back to what you said first is that we can have a word for the internet, and we can use that to communicate and have a conversation about something, but even without even knowing what that is. And I feel like I have the same attitude towards images, which is that I have no faith in them. I don't think that they'll tell you truth or reveal anything at all. We can have a fight about that, but it's a really boring fight, so let's not. But I think about them as vocabularies, right? So it's things that we use to try to make sense of the word. We should not have faith in them. They are not grounded in any kind of capital T truth, but nonetheless, they're helpful to us in terms of quite literally just learning how to orient ourselves, learning how to make sense of
I
the
think
moment that we're living.
the Silk Route is a very interesting parallel to that, as a notion which, in a sense, never existed in any way. It's a term that was formulated in a very specific book in the 19th century by this guy called von Richthofen, who was the uncle of the Red Baron. I don't know whether any of you were brought up with the stories of the Red Baron, the flying ace, the German. This guy's uncle was a great geographer and wrote a book called The Silk Route, before which no one had ever thought of the Silk Route. They'd occasionally been books on trade between the Roman Empire and China and this sort of thing. But this phrase, which is such an easy, like the internet, it encapsulates the whole world, which actually sort of, in a sense, doesn't exist.
Yeah.
The Silk Route was a million different things in different places. It never went from one place to another. There were landing spots like Alexandretta, where you could say that, in a sense, where the route sort of hits from Aleppo and hits the Mediterranean. But it's as notional as your pictures of a beach, which may or may not have the cables exactly where your picture is. It's a very rough concept, and at various points, the Silk Route went trading. Routes varied according to armies and single rulers and periods of instability, and just like we see this region today.
Absolutely.
I mean, I feel like it's almost an but what's interesting about Trevor's investigation is it has this kind of reverse traction, like we talked about colonialism, where this need to see almost becomes a kind of anti-enlightenment quest for darkness. Not darkness, but invisibility. Like, I feel like the more it gets, I see less, actually, the further we get. And even the whole idea of it being underwater, I mean, I think that there's been lots of scientists who've written about how little we've invested in our visibility underwater as opposed to above the sky, right? And it's this impenetrability, of course, pressure being the major factor of water as opposed to the space. But it seems that we somehow, at least I see or understand less the more I know about these structures.
Absolutely. But this is where your guys' talks were really relevant too, because there is a relationship between those politics of visibility and imagination and power, right? And this is kind of why I had that quip about trade. I was like, trade? No. Like, would you describe the Dutch East India Company as trade? I wouldn't. Is that
It's a whole package of stuff.
Yeah.
All of which is contained in warships.
Yeah.
The Dutch East India Company image that they have on their cannons is of a warship with guns blazing.
Yeah.
It's not of money or trading or a nice picture of a nutmeg or something. It's
you had countless number of tweetable phrases, but one that I wrote down was Facebook with fighter jets. But then I can almost imagine the opposite, right? So fighter jets with Facebook. So
I hope they're not checking their status.
NSA.
NSA. How many likes have they got on their bombing run? It's interesting, though, again, so how these things go at different periods of history. We know about the East India Company founded in three ports, three landing places, like where your things are coming aboard, or where the Silk Route is hitting hitting the sea. Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, three foundations, three ports, and from that, this company then sort of goes inland. But if you go back to the 12th century, you have India doing a similar but slightly different thing in Indonesia. You get these Chola and Pallava trading settlements on the coast of Indonesia, Java, Sumatra, so on. And this is how Sanskrit spreads inland. And so you get this extraordinary process of Sanskritization and the spread of Hinduism and the spread of Buddhism inland. And it again starts with trading places. And then the Brahmins head into the courts, take over the courts, and Java is a Sanskrit word. It's a word from an Indic language. And the same idea that you have these trading ports which generate culture out of them and are modes of diffusion of language, culture, religion. and so on, is something that works from India out to Indonesia in the 12th century.
Actually, I wanted to ask you, William, because again, as Oscar said in his introduction to you, you've written voluminously, extensively, rigorously on various stages of Indian history. How and why did you come to the East India Company now? At this point in your career as a historian and a writer and also an inhabitant of India, at this point now, I was wondering.
Very specifically, I'm interested in where history impinges on the present. So the books I was writing after 9/11 were white Mughals, about Islam and Christianity, and how their relationship was not necessarily a relationship of clashing, that there are moments of great fusion, interaction, and moments of pleasure. And that the history was very much more complex than we were being taught in the post 9/11 period, with Bernard Lewis spouting off about clashes of civilizations and Samuel Huntington and all the rest of it. Then with this book, Return of a King, it's showing how history can prefigure the situation and the mess we've got ourselves into in Afghanistan. You get exactly the same battles being fought in exactly the same places. There was one moment when I was researching on the outskirts of Kandahar, I'd gone to visit the house where Mullah Omar and bin Laden had allegedly done part of the planning for 9/11, which is on a compound on the edge of Kandahar, and it looks down to a beautiful valley below Kandahar, which is very irrigated with a gorgeous Seljuk bridge. And I was reading the diary of the British commander, really, in Kandahar in the first Afghan war, 1841. And he was describing a party of lancers heading down the hill to my right, crossing the bridge, and going off. And literally, as I was reading this very specific description of a particular night in 1841, this Humvee goes clunking down behind me, down over the same bridge. 300 yards in, an IED goes off, this plume of smoke. And so the microgeography of it is absolutely identical. You had an English-speaking garrison manning Kandahar with the same tribe, the same Saduzai tribe that were fighting the same people 150 years ago, still out there waiting to ambush in the same place.
And may I ask, how did where you started with the research be is it where the book starts, or like how was the research of the East India Company conducted?
So specifically,
what kind of archives
this book is specifically about how the company exists for 350 years, but I'm writing about 45 years of that, which is when the company suddenly militarizes and moves from these three factories to take over the whole of the interior, and it's a very quick process. You know how when you're on a project, there is a slither of ice in every one of our hearts when you're on the thing. You're looking for what you're after. You're the hunter, in a way. And I remember watching... Can you remember when Trump came into power that morning, and there was the New York Times had that swingometer, and there was a certain point when it became quite clear that Trump had got into power, and there was no way now that Clinton and the Democrats were going to get the presidency. And of course, there's deep mourning around the world, everyone horrified and frightened by what was happening. But also that slight feeling that, yes, this story is now more relevant than ever, that the East India Company, this is the moment to write a book about corporate power and how corporates can take over the world. And I remember feeling a slight sort of feeling of a thrill as well as a gloom at that moment.
I do have some more questions, but I do want to open it up to the floor. Does anyone have any questions at the back there? If you could just wait for the microphone, and if you could just tell us your name before you speak. Thank you.
Hi, Alain Servet from Belgium. I wanted to go a little bit further in the subject that you approach with Trevor. We have three researchers on the one decided to do it through books, the two others rather through the arts. And I wanted to ask the one that decided to do through the arts, why to use that form in some way, even if maybe it's natural to them, knowing that probably the audience of it and the reception of it and the clarity of the reception, because the people coming for the arts very often prefer not to be disturbed by ideas too much. So they're more...
Is that true?
For the majority, unfortunately. So why to use that medium of expression for what is basically in-depth and high-quality research?
Well, maybe Marina, you could bring me the copy of Mullah Nasruddin as a good example, but I think the answer, first of all, like in literature that Shumon can speak extensively about, I think the interesting about arts is that you're able to investigate things, at least, that are not possible to investigate elsewhere. For example, we've translated arguably the most important journal of the Muslim world of the 20th century. Nobody wanted to translate it. Nobody wanted to publish it except an art publisher. So the fact that art has this sort of zone of indeterminacy allows for people like us to do the work that we do. And I think the relationship, I think what's more interesting is how our research, both William's, Trevor's, but also how the research informs the art, meaning what do we bring as artists that hasn't already been done by scholars like yourself and scholars that you work with or I work with. And I think there, at least in our case, the books and the lectures articulate a certain series of questions, but I believe the art's role is to disarticulate. Mm-hmm. And disarticulate doesn't mean to be silent. It means to undo the thread of the sweater. So it's almost like when somebody's, you know in the movies when they're looking for the killer and the dogs go to the pond and search, and then if somebody just goes like this into the water, the dogs get confused. I think that's art's role, is to confuse. Is to kind of go, is to brouiller la piste in sort of in French.
We've waited 50,000 years for that definition of art. Thanks, Pai. We can all go home forever. Trevor, would you? I mean, again, it's interesting.
That's a beautiful articulation. I mean, I think we are very much animated by that same thing.
But Trevor, I mean, I didn't mention it, but you've written a number of books.
I have, yeah.
And they're not. I mean, this outside of your. I mean, they're books. As I say, I think of them as forms of. I mean, you could say they're forms of investigative journalism or experimental geography. You've done books about military black sites, etc., etc. So, could you say something about your experience in these different worlds? I mean, you've been in the art world. You've been an experimental geographer. You've published, in a way. Non-specialist or general interest books. Could you say something about those moving between those worlds and what each of those worlds allow you to do and not do?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I started writing the books because there was so much research that was going into the art that I felt like this is like a shame in terms of the wasted amount of effort to not just like actually try to say something coherent, or just articulate this. And it sounds like this is exactly what's animating a book like this too. Like this is very important scholarship as well. That presumably you got interested in because it's speaking to the ideas that are animating the questions you're asking as an artist. You know, which is very similar in my case. In terms of working with the different worlds, I don't have anything interesting to say about that, I think. I mean, I guess like writing is sort of pretty solitary and you put this stuff out and then, yeah, I don't know. I guess I was involved in academia for a while and I enjoyed that a lot too. And I kind of, when I was doing geography, I didn't tell anybody that I was doing art for years. They kind of knew, but I didn't want it to be like, it was like, no, we're doing social science. You know? But I guess like there's.
What is experimental geography?
It's I don't want.
No, but I mean, this term experimental geography.
But to this question of audience that the man brought up earlier before, like academia, I think like the normal, like the average number of times that an academic peer-reviewed paper is read is something like 2.3 times or something like that. So we can say, oh, art is this thing that's off to the side that nobody cares about. Really, nobody cares about, you know, the vast majority
very sadly.
What's that?
Sadly, because actually it's a lot of important work that doesn't.
A lot of it's important work, but a lot of it's crap too.
As well.
You know, so I mean, there's. So, I don't know. Sorry.
I'm going to squeeze in. I want to see if we can squeeze in. Are there any other questions? Okay, one here. Could we get a mic here, please?
William, thank you for a wonderful, wonderful lecture there. When is this very exciting book coming out on East India Company, and is Trump doing the forward?
I haven't asked him yet. I'm not sure he writes. 18 more months, I think, probably. 18 more months.
18 more months.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
And do you tell us the title of the book? Is that been
It's
locked?
called The
down?
Anarchy.
The Anarchy, yes.
The anarchy.
The Anarchy. Any more questions? Back there, please.
Hello, my name is Anya. I come from Serbia, independent curator. Referring to the art and more like academic work, do you think, because I've encountered in various occasions the lack of knowledge about the geography from the eastern side of Europe. I see your smile. Do you think that maybe it actually happened in a high institution in London where my lecturer didn't know Czechoslovakia doesn't exist anymore, and it was really kind of I don't know how to say it, but it was quite shocking. And talking about this like center and periphery, and you know, as adults, we don't tend to go back to our history or geography books, or maybe we do, but do you maybe find that it's art's place to maybe show this in a more, I don't know, fun manner, or in a more immediate manner? And at the same time, I'm very interested in etymology, because I speak Greek and Turkish and Serbian as well, clearly. And I'm finding a lot of, you know, interconnectedness between these three languages. And before, when you were referring to the different cities, they had the names changed, and, you know, it's all intertwined. So maybe through language, we can also talk about geography in a different manner.
Thank you.
Well, I mean,
Thank you.
Our universities and today we still use Cold War acronyms. We talked about this in the last Global Art Forum 3 years ago. Manasa is a Cold War acronym. I mean, the Muslim world is defined by Middle East, North Africa, South Asia. And you ask yourself, what happened to Central Asia? What happened to Bukhara Sharif, Samarkand? It's crazy that we skip a heartbeat over these places. Similarly, in the academy, the problem is that we have these, it's very, very few people, because of the structural, this way that the academy is structured, that people are able to study these regions that we're focused on, because they're either in the Ottoman department, and if you study the Caucasus, you're in the Russian studies, Slavic studies, but how can you study the Caucasus without understanding medieval Islam and writing Turkish? How can you study?
In Indian studies, you have the exact same thing. You have a Sanskrit department that does Sanskrit, and it's Indic and basically Hindu, and then you have the Persian department.
Yeah, I mean,
and there's a handful of people that read both Persian and Sanskrit.
Exactly.
And it's an incredibly rich world if you have that both, but it's almost never happens.
And it's shocking, and we just learned recently how few people and how few institutions are equipped to handle these trans-regional studies. And the case of, Czechoslovakia not being known to have dissolved, even until this recent Ukraine and Crimea crisis, all Sovietologists and Russian scholars were out of jobs for 20 years. When I started learning Russian in '94, we were firing Russian professors in the United States because we felt that Russia was no longer relevant. So if Russia is not relevant, then Czechoslovakia definitely is not relevant, sadly, to say.
I'm afraid we have run out of time. I only realized when we all came up on stage that we've accidentally, unintentionally committed the heinous crime of an all-male panel. I'm really sorry about that. But in our defense, the other half of Slavs and Tatars is female. She might not be on stage, but she's spiritually here. And Paim does, maybe one day she'll be allowed on stage. But I do hope that the content made up for our bad gender politics. Will you please join me in thanking amazing William Dalrymple, Slavs and Tatars, and Trevor Paglen. Thank you.